and when you're sort of building yourself, on a social media platform, you just get so worried about, how you want to be perceived by people. Sometimes you come to a point where you realize like, man, that's not me, and in this break, in this hiatus, I realized that, Hello, everyone. Hello, homies. Hello, besties. Kamusta na kayo, mga pre, mga te? Oh my gosh. Welcome to the Sige Homie Podcast, hosted by TheEthanGonzales. It has been a while. It has been a hot minute. The last time I checked, it's been, I think, about 7 months since I've last done an episode for this podcast. I haven't forgotten about this podcast. I just feel like it's just life gotten in the way, and we'll elaborate more on that in this episode. But welcome. I really need to get used to like creating intros like these again. Yeah, it's just been a long time. I'm extremely excited for this episode and finally relaunching my podcast again after this very long hiatus. I just first want to take the time right now to thank everyone who supported me on this podcast journey, essentially. A lot of people have asked me like, Ethan, where's the new episode? We're waiting. And, it just like... It just makes me so happy to hear that. Seriously. So thank you all for your support and your love. So for today's episode, this is episode 2 of the Sige Homie Podcast. And honestly, I just want to emphasize that on this episode, I really feel like this episode is kind of like my first episode of this podcast, and I'll sort of like talk about why I mean that more in this episode. But I feel like we're just starting fresh, as the title says. Ultimately, in this episode, we're just gonna sit down and chat. We're gonna catch up. We're gonna just talk about how I've been, where I've been, how's life. And ultimately, like what I see for this podcast, looking forward, looking ahead, sort of elaborating on my YouTube video about coming back onto YouTube after like 5 months during that time. So if you haven't already followed this podcast on wherever you're listening, make sure you do so. I feel like, in my opinion, this podcast is dope. It's real. It's honest. It's insightful. I want to use this podcast ultimately to give a perspective to people, who aren't familiar with a particular topic, that is personal to me. I kind of think of this podcast as like my audio diary. You feel like ever since I was in elementary, I've always like loved writing. I've had like diaries in the past. I've had journals. Many of my childhood friends can like remember, like I used to carry little like diaries or journals to school, even in middle school. But I feel like with life and with how stressful it is, like we don't really have time to always write. And so I feel like with a podcast, though, I can just speak whatever on my mind. So yeah, I kind of think of it. I kind of think of this as like an audio diary, So yeah, that's the Sige Homie Podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. So as I mentioned, I kind of consider this episode as like my first solo episode. If you've been, listening to Sige Homie ever since the very beginning, you guys already know that I've had 3 episodes up. But I've taken my 2 solo episodes down. And I'll explain why in a bit. And so I only have up my episode with my first guest, my cousin. And so now, kind of considering this again as like my first episode, I don't know. I just feel like I kind of want to reintroduce Sige Homie, especially to those who didn't know I have a podcast and maybe are stumbling on, my YouTube channel or my Instagram or even just my podcast in general. So right now, I just want to talk about like, why did I decide to make a podcast? Why did I name it Sige Homie? What does Sige Homie mean? Kind of just a refresher, even to those who have been here this whole time. So, in answering the question, why did I decide to make a podcast? I'd say about 2020, 2021, I really got into like listening to podcasts. Obviously, I was mostly at home during those times, and I had a lot of free time. So I discovered a lot of things such as like, listening to podcasts. I never usually listen to podcasts. And I don't know, I just liked it. Like the whole, like putting it in the background while you're doing something, I just, sometimes it can get pretty relaxing and also very insightful. Like you can do something like your chores, but also listen to a podcast and actually, learn something, I usually listen to a lot of Christian podcasts, but, I also love listening to Filipino podcasts. And also, I think one of the first podcasts I really got into was about scary stories, like, actual paranormal stuff. And I don't know, I really like how you can be very transparent on a podcast. It's like a conversation that you're listening to, I feel like podcasts are great for nosy people like me, where we, just spill everything. And also when I was, starting my YouTube channel, I was thinking about like what kind of content I wanted to create. And I really just like talking about stories, talking about different perspectives, talking about my own experience on certain things. And, I feel like with YouTube, it's very much, this is not all the time, but in my opinion, I feel like for YouTube videos, like it's organized, it's structured, it's fast paced. Like when I edit my videos, I try to take out every single breath I take. Whereas it's like, a podcast, it's pretty natural. It's like a conversation. And I really dig that. I really dig, the things you can do with a podcast, the conversations that you can have. So yeah, that's ultimately why I decided to make a podcast. I just thought it was so cool. And so, in the process of like creating my podcast, like I think it was, I'd say in the beginning of the year in 2021, I was like, I should make a podcast. That would be so cool. And so, I, bought my equipment. I just bought one mic and, I said, yeah, I'm going to do a podcast. So in terms of creating the podcast, I mean, it was so exciting. Like what type of name I wanted it to have, what type of vibe did I want it to bring out, the topics I wanted to discuss about. Like it was just so exciting. I kind of want to touch base on like the name process. So when I was thinking of a name, I wanted to do two things. I wanted the name of my podcast to, number one, just run smooth. I want people to say, oh, I'm going to listen to, this podcast, but I want it to like run smooth. I didn't want it to like, you know what I mean? Number two, I wanted to somehow connect some kind of like Filipino and even personal element to my name. And so, back then I was very much, and even up until now, like I was such a perfectionist. When I created this podcast, I said, I wanted it to have the perfect name. And so I spent so much time just deciding on the name itself, not even the vibe, not even the topics. It was the name that really got me. And so, all right, so here's like the process. At first, I wanted to connect something about storytelling or story time. In Tagalog or Filipino, to say story, it's cuento. Or to have a discussion, it's like magcuento, cuentuhan. And I wanted to incorporate that into my podcast name, but I felt like with, other Filipino podcasts that I already listen to, a lot of them, they already have cuento in their name. One of my podcasts that I listen to a lot is called Cuentos with Hannah, and it's a Filipino podcast. And also another one is called Cuentu Juan by the Juans. You should definitely check out their music. So I don't know. I really wanted to be original. I don't want to, copy anyone. So I was like, you know what? Okay, let's scratch off Cuento. And then I ultimately wanted my podcast name to sort of give out this vibe of oh, we're going to tell stories. We're going to be honest here. We're going to, we're going to just talk. And so one of the names that I was really set in stone in for this podcast was called Chismoso. Chismoso, if you don't know, it means in Spanish and also in Tagalog or Filipino, it means like a male gossiper, essentially. And the way I thought of it was with chismoso, we're going to just get real about stuff. We're going to, discuss about stuff. We're going to be honest. We're going to spill all the tea. And so I was set in stone on that, welcome to the Chismoso podcast. But looking back, no. I sort of realized Chismoso really gave the vibe of, we're going to gossip. We're going to, talk bad behind people's backs. We're going to expose. And that was never my initial intent. I wanted to be real in my podcast, but I didn't want to sort of gossip, So, I don't know. I didn't want to I give out that vibe. So if you're watching my video, I might just show some podcast, images. I was even deciding on what the podcast art would look like. And again, I was so set in stone in Chismoso, but we scratched that off. So, by this time, I really wanted to make an episode. I was so excited and I was like, dang, I don't have a name. What am I going to do? And so I remember during, I think it was the academic year was about to end, my junior year. And we thought about I remember we were driving, my dad and I, and we were bouncing off ideas off of each other. And again, I wanted to have some sort of Filipino element to it because again, I'm proud to be Filipino, and I've always done that. I've always incorporated some kind of Filipino element into what I do, essentially. And so we were thinking about, words we could use for my podcast. At first, I think it was my dad who thought about tara, let's go. Come on, as if I'm welcoming you into a conversation. Tara means let's go. You would say tara na, let's go. And I think we sort of that led into the word sige, which means I feel the equivalent to sige is bet. I bet. Sige, let's go. Let's do it. I don't know how to explain it. At first I was thinking I should name it Sige Pre. Pre means it's short for kumpare in Filipino, which means homie. Well, I feel kumpare, guys refer to each other. I think the equivalent to kumpare is bro. I would always hear my dad and his friends refer to each other as kumpare. Hey kumpare, hey bro. But then, I was thinking about my audience of this podcast. I ultimately wanted to welcome everyone. That's, with this podcast, I want it to be a welcoming, area for all types of people, not just limited to, guys or Filipinos. I want to include everyone. And then I thought about Sige Homie. Homie, it can mean your homies. And if you don't know, back then I used to refer to my supporters and my subscribers as, homies. And so I was like, that's perfect. That is perfect. And so that's how I named it Sige Homie. That's how it came. And so putting it together, Sige, it's like I bet, and homie is homie. It's like your best friend, the people that you know. And I wanted it to be like, all right, homie, let's talk. Like, let's, as if I'm welcoming you to, the conversation. Like, all right, homie, let's discuss, let's talk. So yeah, that's, and so yeah, that's how it came to be ultimately. That's what Sige Homie means in its entirety. We're making discussion, we're making cuento, we're talking, as if we're like best friends, So yeah, that's Sige Homie. So another thing that I wanted to cover in this episode for today is, where have I been? Why did I stop? If you don't know, I posted a video about a couple months ago, or even more than that, more or less than that. I came back to YouTube after such a long time. I took a break from this podcast and also my YouTube channel, but I initially came back to my YouTube channel, and I sort of explained why I stopped. Where have I been? And so I just want to elaborate on that. Essentially, I just took a break from my YouTube channel and my podcast. I knew it was coming. I knew I needed it, like this podcast in particular though. I came to a point during the summer because really I did like 3 episodes of this podcast, and I just came to a point where I treated this as a chore. I saw this as a chore. I didn't really enjoy it, and I was like burned out, and I was just so discouraged, really. And I think the reason was that I didn't know my purpose. I really didn't. I came in this, after all, the process of creating a podcast and like the advertising, I had so much fun doing. I really got to like express my creativity and all that, but I just, man, like looking back, I just feel like I wasn't in the right mindset, the right purpose, I ultimately wasn't myself. And especially when you're doing like this, where you're sort of promoting yourself publicly, when you're creating a YouTube channel, and when you're sort of building yourself, on a social media platform, sometimes you just get so worried about, how you want to be perceived by people. And for me, that was me. I was such a perfectionist. The thing with podcasts, is that it's ultimately straight talk. It's like you talking. And when I was making a podcast, like in the initial stages, that's what I was ultimately worried about, was like, how am I going to be seen as perfect, doing an hour podcast episode? Again, I was really a perfectionist back then. I, like right now, like I would have freaked out, every time I said, or like, that's how much of a perfectionist I was, I was too scared that I would, stumble on my words, that I might say the wrong thing. And ultimately that people won't listen to me because, I was either too boring or like trying too much. Also, another confession is that I used to have scripts. Like when I would plan out for a podcast episode back then, I would literally like write out everything that I wanted to say. Cause it's good to have a script at times because like, if you're like me, I forget, what I need to say. And, sometimes when I edit my podcast episodes, it's like, oh man, I should have said that. That would have been good. It's good to have a script, but I feel like I remembered back then when I would shoot my podcasts, I would have to I would want to I don't know how to describe it. I would try to look at the camera as much as possible without looking at the computer. Right now, I have my notes out here so I won't, forget what I'm trying to say. But I was just ultimately trying to be perfect when really it's impossible. It's completely impossible to be perfect. You just want to be perceived in a certain way that sometimes isn't genuinely you. Like that manner you want to be perceived as by people. Sometimes you come to a point where you realize like, man, that's not me, And in this break, in this hiatus, I realized that, I just saw how like, man, like this is something I want to do. I like this type of stuff, like making a podcast, talking about stuff, but like, I'm worried about it so much to the point where I couldn't do it anymore. I remember when I first shot my first episode of this podcast, my very first episode, I shot it 3 times. And that was like, I think an hour episode. Man, that's crazy. It was so tiring. And again, like I was trying to like look and try to say everything I need to say, like by looking at notes, but like also maintaining eye contact with the camera. And, it wasn't healthy, man. It wasn't. And also like comparison got me a lot. I personally like compared myself a lot to other creators, other podcasts, other people. I wanted results. I ultimately wanted results fast. I wanted to have like a large audience by the time I posted my first episode, which is not realistic. I didn't enjoy it. I really didn't. And also another thing to consider is that I was going back into school. So I really just didn't have, time to sit down and like edit a podcast or shoot a podcast episode because, I had to focus on school. And so I took a break. I took a 5 or so month break, but honestly, like I never would have expected that this break would help me so much. I mentioned this in my video, but I got closer to God. I redefined my purpose, and what I want to achieve with this podcast, like why am I doing it? And I feel like for this podcast, what I realize is not only am I talking about my experience with things, and like covering certain topics, but I want to be able to recognize God in this process, and I want to be able to acknowledge and be mindful about, his purpose for me through this podcast, like instead of worrying about, dang, I only got 3 listens on this episode. Like I want to be able to represent, God through this podcast. I just want to say, like, even if you're not a Christian, I welcome you to this podcast. It's never my place to judge, to condemn, to say, no, this podcast is for a particular group of people, even though most of my like humor relates mostly to Gen Z. I ultimately just welcome everyone. And in this space, you are loved. In this space, you are welcomed. And so ultimately, yeah, that's just it. I essentially came to a point where like, yeah, I want to do this podcast, but this time I'm going to put God first above everything. So talking about like the future of this podcast, I just want to be my genuine self, man. Like something that I've been saying on my YouTube channel is at the end of each video, I try to say like, if you like my vibe, make sure you subscribe, like not everyone's going to like you. Not everyone is going to want to listen to your podcast, nor is everyone going to like how you look or how you act. Like for me, I've always been a people pleaser. Like, that's just been a struggle of mine, even until now. I just try to, I just really want, everyone to be happy. But, I feel like that isn't your purpose, And so I want to be able to express myself genuinely and not like try to make myself seem a certain way, so that I can like obtain an audience. If in the future, if I obtain an audience, that's great. But, I don't want to change myself so that I can obtain that eventually. Also, in this podcast, I'm going to be speaking about a variety of topics. I'm just really excited where this podcast is going to go. I'm honestly going in with faith and an open mind, essentially. I'm also really excited about the guests that are going to be featured on this podcast. Back in 2021, before my abrupt break, I planned a lot of guests and I planned a lot of episodes, but they were never really fulfilled, and so now I feel like that I'm in a better, perspective, I guess. I'm just really excited. These guests are people that are special to me. And, not only are they from the United States, but they're also from the Philippines as well. I'm really excited. And in terms of like the structure of an episode, it's honestly like, I just want this to be conversation based. I feel like I've said conversation a lot in this episode, but seriously, like, I feel like what I really lacked back then when I was starting this episode was like, I treated it as though this was like a speech. This was, like, this is serious, when really, man, like, this is a conversation, if this, in terms of a conversation, if this lasts for 20 minutes, cool, but maybe some episodes might last for an hour. We'll see. Usually for guests, because I feel like when I do an episode for an hour, this is going to be so tiring. And what if I have to like use the bathroom or something like that? But I want to try to do as much episodes as I can. Currently, I'm in, school still. And so it's kind of hard to stay consistent, but I have to admit, like for some seniors, okay, let me go off for a second. Some seniors, so if you don't know, I'm a senior. I'm in 12th grade. And so this is like my last year of high school. And man, like I see some seniors, they have it so easy. They have so many partials. They're taking the easiest class. But for many and for myself, like school, it can be so time consuming. Like honestly, it can kind of be stressful. And especially with like major senioritis, like, but I want to be able to prioritize and manage my time wisely, especially like with this podcast, yeah, ultimately I'm just hyped for this podcast, where it's going to go. I have a new plan of execution now, I guess. And this time, I'm doing it with my bestie, Jesus. And so, I'm just hyped. I'm really looking forward to working on this podcast. I also forgot to talk about earlier. I mentioned that I took down sort of, I think 2 of my episodes that I've done for this podcast already. Ultimately, the reason why I took it down was like, I felt like I just feel like I wasn't myself, That's why I'm trying to, like, I was sort of emphasizing, like, starting fresh, starting new, because I want to be authentic. I just want to be Ethan, even outside of the camera. Like, I want to just be myself. And I felt like, as I said, I wasn't that, especially in front of a camera. So, again, that's why I sort of, like, emphasize this whole, like, starting fresh, starting new, because, this is me. This is actually Sige Homie, like an authentic podcast, you know, I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah. So, all right, on to the next segment. Where has Ethan been? What the heck has been happening to him? As I said, I'm in the second semester of my senior year of high school, and I'm just chugging through it. I have major senioritis. I've been struggling for so long. I just want to graduate, man. It's so bad. But again, I don't want it to come to me. I'm trying to like manage my stress levels. Like seriously, when I began high school, I used to be so stressed to the point where I would literally worry about going to school. Like driving to school, I would be shaking. I would feel sweaty because now, I don't want that, I'm just trying to take it slow. Just try not to stress out myself too much. And I feel like, that should be a thing, not only for seniors, but also for like anyone in school, is to not stress yourself out too much. I've struggled with that a lot. This is a whole podcast episode, but just in shortest terms as possible, like I've learned that, it's not necessary to do that. That perfection isn't, attainable. Like, I feel like I've tried to be perfect for so long, but really it's not possible, But yeah, we have a couple months left, and, I'm just trying to work as best as I can, and we're just gonna, oh my gosh. I just thought about, how like high school, the administration, like, especially to upperclassmen, they're always like, you got this, finish this year strong. I'm like, what if I can? What if I can? Like, me personally, academically, am I doing good? Anyways, no, seriously, like, it's been rough. But we're just trying to finish the year strong, as the administration would say. Another thing is that I have been building my relationship with God. Day by day. It's a daily thing. I feel like there's a lot of just up and downs. I have to say that. Especially like sort of embarking this relationship with, God a couple months ago. I realized like it isn't always like sunshine and like, you feel so loved. Like honestly, it can get bad at times. It can get dark. You can feel so lonely, One of the things that I want to cover on this podcast is isolation. I feel like God has put me in a point where, compared to in the past, I've felt really like just isolated, in terms of like, I don't really have that much friends, in school. I don't really talk to that much people. And also like back then, I really, really wanted to have a girlfriend in high school. Yeah, I want to be in a relationship, but I don't know. I just feel like that there's just some significance to like isolation, Honestly, in this podcast, I want to talk about like the struggles as a Christian, like mental health, or even like just straight up jealousy. Like that's real. Like comparison and jealousy and covetousness, like that's real. And also like insecurities, Yeah, like as I said, it's not really a easy thing to follow God, but I can say that it's a very humbling and bettering experience for yourself, physically, mentally, and spiritually. So, yeah. Another thing that's going on in my life is volleyball. So my school has their first men's volleyball team. And since COVID, I haven't really like played sports. I haven't been really athletic. I've been working out, but it's not like it's not like joining a sports team where it's like every day you practice or every day you do something physical, And so I was thinking about like joining, the volleyball team at my school. And also like, I feel like with volleyball, man, I used to be really good at volleyball. I'm not going to lie. But I feel like when I say that, I'm referring to gym volleyball, where it's like you're hitting the ball. So essentially, I went to like this volleyball camp a couple of days ago, kind of just to see, because like, again, honestly, I'm still a beginner. My parents used to play volleyball back in like high school and college, but I've never played like actual, like serious volleyball, you know? And so we were put in a game. And the way I understood volleyball was like you just hit the ball, when really it's not like that, bro. So I was in the back, you know, and like every time a ball came at me, I just hit it. And I got it over the net. I remember even someone said like, they said something along the lines of, oh, that works too. I'm like, oh, am I doing something wrong? You know, try something new. If you're listening to this, try something new. It is hard to, you know, put yourself out there. Back then, I would have never done such a thing. Like back then, I would want to have like friends right by my side to like do it with me. But honestly, I feel like not just volleyball, but just in school and life in general, I've just learned to do things alone. You know, like I saw this TikTok, how it's like you come to a point where you know, you're cool with people not, you know, doing stuff with you, if that makes sense. I feel like I've relied on people so much. I never really gotten out of my comfort zone, you know. And I'm just thinking back to like freshman Ethan. If he was in front of me right now, I would have just told him, bro, you're cool alone. And what I mean by that is like, don't worry if you're alone. Don't be dwelling in that, you know. You're cool. Have some confidence. For me, I've never played volleyball like in a manner like this where it's like serious, you know. I was genuinely pretty nervous when I got into volleyball camp because I was like, bro, I feel like I'm the only one who isn't that athletic, isn't that like, you know, good at this sport. But I realized like, yo, this is fun. You know, I got to meet new people. I don't know. We'll see if, you know, if this is for me or if this is not. Yeah, that's life so far. Nothing too crazy. Just pretty laid back for me, you know. All right. So to wrap up this episode, I kind of want to add a segment where I talk about things that I've been into lately. This could mean anything from style to music to food to verses to, you know, items I've found on Amazon. Like this could mean anything. So yeah, this is what I've been into lately. All right. Number 1, Australian accents. Where should I get started? Okay. So basically, I don't know. Like I've just saw how so cool Australian accents are. To me, I feel like all accents are cool, but like Australian accents, man, I feel like it's pretty unique. In my high school, I always hear people talking in, you know, trying to mimic different accents, like the British accent or the Southern accent, you know. I feel like the British accent, everyone knows it. Everyone, you know, I've heard a lot of people, you know, try it. But have I heard them speak in an Australian accent? And I feel like the answer is no. This is bad. I like genuinely, I really want to learn how to master an Australian accent. A lot of the celebrities I like, for example, Rosé from Blackpink, you know, like she speaks in an Australian accent. And I just think it's cool. I actually have this story. So I was in my lab class, right? In school. And I was like approaching my friend and I was talking to them in an Australian accent. And, you know, just because, you know, like you go up to your friend like, hello, mate, you know, something like that. And there was this one girl in front of us and she was like, wait, are you actually from like Australia? I'm like, yeah. I just played along with it. I was like, yeah, I'm from Australia. I'm from Melbourne. Nice to meet you. And she went along with it. She thought for like a couple of weeks, she thought, you know, I'm from Australia. And she actually confronted me in a football game. And she was like, you're not from Australia. I know it. you are not from Australia. And I'm like, oh, what are you talking about? Like, wait, no. The thing with me, when I try to do an Australian accent, I like combine different accents, like the British accent, and like I can't even like, I feel like I can't even do a British accent because I get it confused with like an Australian accent. I'm sorry if you're Australian and you were listening to this. I'm so sorry that I'm like butchering it. Please, someone teach me. It's like, I feel like Australian accents are pretty dope. So, yeah, you might hear me in this podcast just randomly talking Australian or my version of an Australian accent. This is not accurate whatsoever. I've never been to Australia. Thank you. So yeah, sorry guys, sorry. But yeah, so another thing that I'm into is this Korean dish. So kind of to talk about like my connection with like Korean culture and all that. I'm not Korean, but I just like, ever since I was a kid, I've always like had this sort of like, you know, outlet to, you know, Korean culture, to learn about Korean culture, whether that be like in my community. I've met a lot of Korean people. You know, growing up, I learned Taekwondo, or like the Korean martial art, Taekwondo. And so like, you know, and just being Filipino, man, like we're so influenced, I feel like, by Korean culture, in terms of like, you know, Korean media, like Korean dramas. We love Korean dramas, K-pop and all that, you know. And even like when I visit the Philippines, there's so many like samgyeopsal, like Korean barbecue is so popular there right now. Like it's cool. And so there's this one dish that I'm really into. It's called naengmyeon, and it's like Korean cold noodles. It's like, I feel like to the Western, you know, eyes, that's kind of weird, but it's really good. And I've just been craving it. And so I just put it in my notes, like, talk about naengmyeon. So it's like, I don't know how to describe it. It's like this cold, you know, I don't know. It's good. It's like savory, but it's ultimately good for the summer. Like, guys, the weather here where I live, it's like 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Last night, like for a couple nights, it's been like -4 degrees. I don't know. I've just been craving naengmyeon, even though it's still the winter. But yeah, and that's it. Honestly, but yeah, that's episode 2 of the Sige Homie Podcast. Thank you all for listening. If you made it up to here, again, I'm just excited. I'm genuinely excited about where this podcast is going to go. And, you know, I'm just happy that, you know, at this point, I'm in a better situation. I'm in a better mindset. And I just hope that this podcast inspires. I hope this podcast, you know, makes someone's day better. I hope that people can learn from this podcast, you know. And ultimately, I just hope that I can serve God through this podcast. So, all right, I'm going to let y'all go. Thank y'all so much again for listening. And until next time, peace.